The boy stood on my porch in the rain. No umbrella, no coat, holding a photograph in both hands, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. He couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Water ran down his face, and I could not tell which drops were rain and which were tears. He looked up at me with my late wife's exact eyes, and he said, in a voice that shook, "I think you're my grandfather. They told me you were dead." I heard my own heartbeat in my ears. Behind him, at the curb, a black car idled with its lights off, and a woman I did not recognize watched us through the windshield without moving. The boy pushed the photograph toward me. It was a picture of Margaret and me on our wedding day, 44 years ago. A photograph that had only ever existed in one place, inside a locked box, inside a house that was supposed to be empty. Before I tell you what happened next, and I promise you, it is going to matter, do me one small favor. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. I read every single one, and if stories about family, loyalty, and quiet strength mean something to you, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Because what this boy handed me on that porch unraveled a lie that had been growing for 11 years. To understand any of it, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. My name is Nathaniel Reyes. I am 71 years old, and for 39 of those years, I worked as a forensic accountant. If you don't know what that is, it's simple enough. Companies and courts and sometimes the government would hire me to look at numbers that other people had tried very hard to hide, and to find the truth buried underneath them. Embezzlement, fraud, cooked books, money moved through shell companies and offshore accounts and fake invoices. People spend a great deal of energy making lies look like the truth. My entire career was learning to see the shape of the lie underneath. I was good at it. I was patient. Patience, I have learned, is the most underestimated weapon a person can carry, because everyone assumes that a quiet man is a harmless one. I retired at 68, 3 years before that boy appeared on my porch. I had a modest house in a quiet town in the Ohio Valley, a pension that was more than enough, and a wife I loved more than I have ever been able to put into words. Her name was Margaret. We met when we were both 26. At a library of all places, both of us reaching for the same book, and we were married 11 months later. She was a pediatric nurse for 31 years. She had a laugh that filled a room and a way of looking at a person that made them feel like the only human being alive. She could read me better than I could read a balance sheet, which is saying something. 43 years we had together. It was not enough. It would never have been enough. We had one son, his name was Daniel, and here is where I have to be honest with you, because this story doesn't work if I pretend our family was perfect. It wasn't. Daniel was a difficult young man, not cruel, not when he was young, just restless and angry in a way we never fully understood. He fought us on everything. He left home at 19, and for a few years we barely heard from him. Margaret cried over that boy more nights than I can count, and I held her, and I told her he would find his way back, because that is what you tell the person you love, even when you are not sure you believe it. And for a while, it looked like I was right. When Daniel was 27, he came home for Christmas, and he brought a young woman with him. Her name was Vanessa. She was polished, poised, beautiful, in a careful, arranged sort of way. She smiled a great deal and said all the right things, and I remember thinking, even that first night, that her smile never quite reached her eyes. Margaret noticed it too. Later, in the kitchen, my wife dried a dish slowly and said quietly, "That one is measuring the house." I laughed and told her she was being unkind. Margaret rarely disliked anyone, but she was not laughing, and I should have paid closer attention to that, because Margaret was almost never wrong about people. She had spent 31 years reading the faces of frightened parents and sick children. She knew the difference between warmth and the performance of warmth. Daniel and Vanessa married the following spring, and for a couple of years, things were genuinely good. Daniel seemed steadier. He'd found work at a logistics company, and Vanessa managed what she called their brand, though I never fully understood what that meant. Then, 2 years into the marriage, they gave us the greatest gift of our lives, a grandson. They named him Samuel Reyes. I want you to understand what that child meant to my wife. Margaret had spent her whole career loving other people's children, and now, finally, there was one of her own to love. Sammy, we called him. He had Margaret's eyes, the same warm hazel with a ring of gold near the center, and he had a gravity to him even as an infant, a way of staring at you with total seriousness before breaking into a grin that could stop your heart. Margaret would drive 2 hours each way just to hold him for an afternoon. She knit him blankets. She kept a drawer of his drawings. On his 2nd birthday, we took that wedding photograph out and showed it to him, the one of Margaret and me on our wedding day, and Margaret told him, "This is where the whole family started, sweetheart. Right here." She had it framed and kept it on the shelf in our study. That is the photograph the boy handed me on the porch. I need you to remember that, because it becomes the thread that unravels everything. When Sammy was 3, things began to change. Vanessa grew distant. Phone calls stopped being returned. Visits that had been every few weeks became every few months, then rarer still. Daniel seemed to shrink whenever we saw him, quieter, more evasive, always checking his phone as though waiting for permission to speak. When we asked to see Sammy, there was always a reason we couldn't. He had a cold. They were traveling. It wasn't a good weekend. Margaret felt it before I did. Mothers do. She would hang up the phone and sit very still, and I would ask what was wrong, and she would say, "They're pulling him away from us, Nathaniel. I don't know why, but they are." I told her she was imagining it. I told her families go through phases, that Daniel and Vanessa were busy, that it would pass. I was wrong. I have made a great many calculations in my life, and gotten very few of them wrong, but that one I got wrong, and I have had to live with it. When Sammy was 4, Vanessa called us on a Tuesday evening. I remember it was raining, the same kind of steady rain that would fall years later when his son came to my door. Vanessa's voice was cool and rehearsed. She told us that she and Daniel had been talking, and that they felt our involvement was, and I remember the exact word she used, destabilizing. That Sammy was confused by having too many authority figures. That they thought it was best if we took a step back, gave them space to parent without interference. I asked to speak to Daniel. There was a pause, and then Daniel came on the line, and my son, my only child, said in a flat and lifeless voice that he agreed with his wife, and that we should respect their decision, and that he would call us when things settled down. He never called. We tried. God, we tried. Margaret wrote letters, long ones, careful ones, full of love and free of blame, and they went unanswered. We sent birthday cards with money folded inside. We drove to their house once, unannounced, and no one answered the door, though I saw a curtain move on the 2nd floor. We considered a lawyer, and I actually met with one, a family attorney named Frank Delgado, who became, years later, a good friend. But grandparents' rights in our state were thin, and Daniel was Sammy's father, and there was no abuse, no neglect we could point to, nothing but a wall of silence that we had no legal crowbar to pry open. Frank was honest with me. He said, "Nathaniel, unless something changes, the law is not going to force that door open." I paid him for his time, and I drove home, And I did not tell Margaret how hopeless it was, because I could not bear to. The years went by. This is the part that is hard to say. The years simply went by. Sammy turned 5, then 6, then 7, and we knew it only by the calendar, because we did not see him. Margaret never stopped hoping. She kept his drawings in that drawer. She kept knitting, sizing the sweaters up each year, guessing at how big he'd grown, and stacking them in a cedar chest for a day she believed would come. On what would have been his 8th birthday, I found her sitting on the floor of the study, holding that wedding photograph, and she looked up at me and said, "Do you think he even remembers us?" And I had no answer that would not have broken both our hearts. Then, when Sammy was 9, my Margaret got sick. It was pancreatic cancer, and it was fast, the way that particular cruelty often is. From diagnosis to the end was 14 weeks. I am not going to spend long here, because some things are mine to keep, but I will tell you that in her last clear week, when the pain was managed and she could still speak, she took my hand and she made me promise her something. She said, "Nathaniel, promise me you'll find him. Not to fight anyone, not for revenge, just so he knows, just so that boy knows, somewhere out there, that he was loved from the very first day. Promise me he'll know that." I promised her. Margaret died on a Thursday morning in October, with the early light coming through the window, and my hand in both of hers. She was 69 years old. I have never known a finer human being, and I say that as a man who spent his life learning to see people clearly. I want to pause here for just one moment, because if you have ever lost someone and been left holding a promise you weren't sure you could keep, I think you understand exactly where I was standing. If this is landing with you, let me know in the comments. It helps more than you'd think to know someone out there is listening. After the funeral, I tried to reach Daniel. I called the number I had. It was disconnected. I sent a letter to their last known address, telling my son that his mother had died and when the service would be, giving him the chance to say goodbye to her. The letter came back 3 weeks later, unopened, stamped with the words, "No longer at this address." They had moved, and they had not told me, and my wife went into the ground without her son or her grandson, knowing she was gone. I grieved. For a long while, I confess. I did very little else. The house was unbearably quiet. I would set 2 cups of coffee out of habit, and then stand there, staring at the second one. Grief is a strange country, and I lived in it, alone, for the better part of 2 years. I aged more in those 2 years than in the decade before them. And then, on a rainy evening in my 71st year, the doorbell rang. I almost didn't answer it. I was not expecting anyone, and a man who lives alone learns to distrust the doorbell after dark. But it rang again, and then again, insistent, and something in the sound of it made me get up out of my chair. I opened the door, and there he was, a boy of 9, soaked to the skin, holding my wedding photograph in both hands, looking up at me with Margaret's own eyes. "I think you're my grandfather," he said. "They told me you were dead." For a moment, I could not speak. It was not possible. Sammy would be 11 now, not 9, and this child was clearly younger. And yet the eyes were unmistakable, that warm hazel with the ring of gold. And he was holding the photograph that lived in a locked cedar chest, in a house I had not opened to anyone. I knelt down, slowly, because at 71, you do everything slowly, and I looked at him, and I said, in as gentle a voice as I could manage, "What's your name, son?" He said, "My name is Eli. Eli Reyes. Not Samuel. Eli." I had a grandson I knew nothing about. Behind him, the black car at the curb turned on its headlights, and a voice from the sidewalk, a woman's voice, sharp and afraid, called out, "Eli, Eli, get back in the car, right now." The boy flinched at the sound of it. He looked at me with a desperation I will never forget, and he whispered, fast and low, "Please, they lie about everything." And then he turned and ran back toward the car, and the woman I did not recognize bundled him inside, and the car pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the rain before I had gotten a single word out. I stood in my open doorway, in the cold and the wet, holding nothing but the photograph he had pressed into my hands. And I understood two things, with the absolute clarity that had defined my whole career. The first was that I had another grandchild, one whose existence had been hidden from me completely. The second was that a locked chest in my house was not as locked as I had believed, and someone had been in it. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my study with the photograph on the desk in front of me. And I did what I have always done when the world stops making sense. I started gathering facts. I began with the photograph itself. It was genuine, my genuine wedding photograph, but it was not the print I had framed. The one on my shelf was still there, in its frame, undisturbed. This was a second print, slightly smaller. On paper stock I recognized. Margaret had ordered a handful of reprints years ago, for an anniversary, and had given them to family, which meant this print had almost certainly come from Daniel, from my son. Somehow this boy, Eli, had gotten hold of a photograph that had belonged to Daniel, and had carried it across who knew how many miles to find the man in it. "They told me you were dead." That was the sentence I kept returning to. Someone had told this child that his grandfather was dead. Not gone, not estranged, dead. That was a deliberate lie, and a specific one. And in my experience, deliberate specific lies are told for a reason. People don't manufacture a death without a motive. I had spent decades finding the motive under the money, and every instinct I had was awake now for the first time in 2 years. The next morning, I called the one person I trusted completely, Frank Delgado, the family attorney I'd consulted years before, who had since become a friend, the kind of friend who checks on a widower and drags him out for a bad diner breakfast once a month, whether he wants to go or not. I told Frank everything. The boy, the car, the photograph, the word dead. Frank was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then he said, in the careful voice of a man who has seen how ugly families can get, "Nathaniel, I need you to prepare yourself. A child that age doesn't show up on a doorstep by accident. Somebody either sent him or he ran, and either way, there is a reason someone told him you were in the ground." I asked Frank what I should do. He said, "We find out who that boy is, legally, carefully, and without tipping our hand, because if there's a second grandchild you never knew about, there is a paper trail, and paper doesn't lie the way people do. Paper doesn't lie." I had built a career on that truth, and I felt, for the first time since Margaret died, something other than grief moving through me. It was purpose, cold and clear and steady. I did not know it yet, but I was about to spend the last strength of my life pulling on a single thread, and the entire tapestry of lies my son and his wife had woven was going to come apart in my hands. What I found when I started pulling was worse than anything I had imagined. Frank connected me with a private investigator, a former police detective named Elena Cruz, who had left the force to do exactly this kind of quiet, patient work. I liked her immediately. She did not waste words. She did not make promises she couldn't keep. And she understood that I did not want vengeance. I wanted the truth, and that the two are not the same thing, even when they arrive together. I gave Elena everything I had, which was almost nothing. A first name, Eli. A last name, Reyes. A photograph. a partial description of a woman and a black sedan, and the last known address where my letter had bounced, 2 years old. It was enough. It is almost always enough, if you know how to look. Within a week, Elena had the first pieces. Daniel and Vanessa had moved 4 times in the years since they cut us off, drifting steadily downward, from a nice suburb to a rougher one, from a house they owned to a house they rented to an apartment. And there, in the public records, Elena found the thing that made my blood run cold. There was no record anywhere of a child named Eli Reyes, but there was a death certificate for Samuel Reyes, my grandson Sammy, filed when he was, the certificate said, 7 years old. Cause of death, listed as complications from a congenital heart condition. I sat in Elena's small office, and I looked at that document, and the room seemed to tilt around me. Sammy, our Sammy, with Margaret's eyes, dead at 7, and we had never known, never been told, never allowed to grieve. Margaret had gone to her own grave knitting sweaters for a boy who was already gone. I put my hand over my mouth, and I am not ashamed to say that I wept, in that office, in front of a woman I'd known for 1 week. Elena let me weep, and then, when I had gathered myself, she said something in a very quiet, very careful voice that changed the entire shape of the thing. She said, "Mr. Reyes, I need you to look at this death certificate very closely, because I have looked at a great many of these, and there is something wrong with it." I wiped my eyes, and I looked, and because I had spent 39 years looking at documents designed to deceive, I saw it too, once she'd pointed me toward it. The certificate was real, in the sense that it was a genuine document filed with a genuine county office, but the details were wrong in the small ways that only show up when someone has fabricated a story around a real form. The physician who signed it was listed at a clinic that, Elena had already confirmed, had closed its doors 8 months before the date on the certificate. The hospital of death was named, but Elena had called them, and they had no record of any patient by that name, ever. And the congenital heart condition. Sammy had been born perfectly healthy. Margaret, a pediatric nurse who examined that child head to toe every time she held him, would have known instantly if there had been a heart defect. There wasn't one. The death certificate was a forgery. Sammy might be dead, or Sammy might be very much alive. But either way, someone had gone to the criminal trouble of filing a fraudulent death certificate for my grandson, and I could think of only a few reasons why anyone would ever do such a thing. And then Eli, the boy on my porch, with Margaret's exact eyes, the eyes that ran in our family, 9 years old now. Sammy would be 11. I asked Elena the question I was afraid to ask. I said, "Is it possible that the boy who came to my door, this Eli, is the same child as Samuel? That they didn't just fake his death, but changed his name, changed his age on paper, and hid him in plain sight under a different identity?" Elena looked at me steadily and said, "Mr. Reyes, in my experience, when someone forges a death certificate for a child who is still breathing, it is almost always to make that child disappear from someone, from a court, from a debt, from another parent, or from a grandfather who might have a legal claim. The question isn't whether it's possible. The question is why. Find the why, and you'll find the truth. Find the why. Paper doesn't lie. Everything I had ever learned was pointing the same direction now, and I made a decision, sitting in that office, that I would follow this thread to the very end no matter where it led, and no matter what it cost me. I had made my Margaret a promise. Find him, so he knows he was loved. I intended to keep it. But I understood now that keeping it was going to mean walking straight into whatever it was that my son and his wife had built their lives on top of. I did not yet know that they had built their lives on top of something so much larger and darker than a family estrangement. I did not know that Eli, that brave, soaked, trembling boy, had been sent to my door on purpose, and that the woman in the black car had risked everything to bring him there. I did not know that I was not the only person hunting for the truth about my grandson, but I was about to find out, and to find out, I was going to have to do the one thing I do better than almost anyone alive. I was going to have to make everyone believe I was a harmless, grieving, confused old man who knew nothing at all. The old lion, I have read, does not chase. He waits at the water's edge, still as a stone, until the moment is exactly right. The whole herd walks past him, and not one of them sees the danger, because danger is supposed to move, and he does not move. That was going to be me. I was going to be still. I was going to be underestimated, and I was going to wait. The first thing I did was the hardest thing, because it went against every instinct I had. I did nothing visible at all. Elena had warned me. She said, "If you go charging at Daniel and Vanessa now, with a forged death certificate and a boy's story, you will accomplish exactly one thing. You'll tell them you know, and the moment they know you know, that boy vanishes. This time for good, and any chance of the truth vanishes with him. Whatever they're hiding, they've hidden it well enough to fool a county records office. They will not hesitate to run." So I waited, and I watched, and I let Elena do the quiet work while I built my role. The role was a grieving, declining old man, and I am ashamed to say it was not hard to play, because it was mostly true. I was grieving. I was old. What I added was the decline. I made sure, in the small ways that get back to people, that word began to travel, that Nathaniel Reyes was not doing well, that the loss of his wife had broken something in him, that he was forgetful now, that he'd been seen wandering, that he'd repeated himself at the pharmacy and gotten confused about his own address. I told a cousin, the family gossip, that I worried I was losing my memory. I knew it would travel. Families are leaky vessels. Within a month, I was confident the story had reached Daniel and Vanessa, wherever they were, that the old man was fading, harmless, and soon to be gone. While I performed my decline, Elena hunted. And what she brought back, piece by piece over the following weeks, assembled into a picture that took my breath away. Vanessa, it turned out, was not who she had ever pretended to be. Elena traced her back through a trail of changed names and abandoned addresses that stretched to before Daniel had ever met her. The polished young woman my son had brought home for Christmas, the one Margaret had said was measuring the house, had a history. 2 prior marriages, both to older, wealthier men, both ending abruptly, and both leaving Vanessa considerably richer than she'd gone in. One of those former husbands had died. The circumstances, Elena said carefully, had been ruled natural at the time, but the man's children had contested it bitterly and lost. Vanessa had a pattern, and the pattern was money, and the pattern involved making inconvenient things disappear. My son, I began to understand, had not married a difficult woman. He had married a predator, and somewhere over the years, he had either become her partner or her prisoner, and I did not yet know which. But the money was the key. It is always the money. Elena and I, working together now, the retired forensic accountant and the retired detective, began to follow it, and the money led us somewhere I never expected. It led us to my own family. Margaret's mother, my mother-in-law, a formidable woman named Rosalind, had died 6 years earlier, at the age of 94. Rosalind had come from old money, timber and railroads generations back, and while much of it had thinned over the years, she had died a genuinely wealthy woman. Her estate, I knew, had been substantial. What I had never paid close attention to, because Margaret and I had never needed the money and had never expected much, was exactly how that estate had been structured and where it had gone. Elena's research and Frank's legal digging turned up the answer, and the answer was a knife to the heart. Rosalind had loved her great-grandson. She had met Sammy only a handful of times before the estrangement, but she had adored him, this bright boy with her granddaughter's eyes. And when Rosalind rewrote her will in her final years, she had done something that, in retrospect, set the entire tragedy in motion. She had established a trust, a very large trust, larger than I had ever imagined, funded from the bulk of her estate, and the sole beneficiary of that trust was Samuel Reyes, my grandson, Sammy, to be held for him until he reached the age of 25, with distributions for his care, his health, and his education along the way, administered by a trustee. And the trustee she had named, the person given control over the disbursement of that entire fortune on behalf of a child, was the child's mother, Vanessa. I understood everything in a single, sickening rush, the way you sometimes see the whole shape of a fraud in one instant after months of staring at pieces. Rosalind had, with the best of intentions, placed a fortune in the hands of a woman who existed to take fortunes from people, and she had made it payable to a child who, if he were to die, would trigger, I was certain, some contingency in that trust. I called Frank and asked him the question, and Frank pulled the trust language, and there it was. If Samuel Reyes died before reaching 25, the entire remaining trust would pass, in full, to his surviving parent or parents, to Vanessa and Daniel. A living child meant a controlled allowance, doled out under a trustee's fiduciary duty, subject to accounting, watched over, limited. A dead child meant the whole fortune, free and clear, no strings, no oversight, no one watching. That was the why. That was the why Elena had told me to find. They had not faked Sammy's death to hide him from me. They had faked Sammy's death to collect on him. But Sammy wasn't dead. Eli, the boy on my porch, with Margaret's eyes, 9 years old on paper, but surely older, holding the family photograph, whispering please. They lie about everything. Sammy was alive. They had killed him only on paper, buried him only in a forged certificate, and then they had hidden the living boy under a new name and a younger age, a ghost of a child, a boy who legally did not exist, so that a dead boy could pay out a fortune. I had to sit down on the floor of my study when I fully understood it. My grandson was alive, and my son and his wife had erased him from the earth for money. And they had told that little boy that his own grandfather was dead, so that he would never come looking, never talk, never be a loose thread. And somehow, some way, that little boy had found the family photograph, had learned the truth, or guessed it, and had risked everything to come and find me. And the woman in the black car, who had brought him, who had told him to get back inside, her voice sharp with fear. Not anger, I realize now. Fear. Who was she? An accomplice would not have let the boy get anywhere near my door. She had let him. She had, perhaps, driven him there. I asked Elena to find the woman in the black car, and I told her I thought that woman was not our enemy. I thought that woman might be the only reason my grandson was still alive. I was right. But the truth of who she was would take longer to surface, and by the time it did, everything would already be racing toward the edge. For now, I sat in my study, an old man alone, holding a wedding photograph, and I made a second promise, this one to Margaret's memory. I had promised her I would find the boy, so he would know he was loved. Now, I promised her something more. I promised her that the people who had done this were going to answer for it, completely, in front of everyone, in the full light of day, not in a dark car in the rain, in the open, where everyone could see. The old lion had found the scent. Now he only had to wait for the herd to come to the water. Patience is a discipline, and I had spent a lifetime practicing it. But I will not pretend those weeks were easy. Every hour that passed was an hour that a 9-year-old boy spent in a house with the 2 people who had erased him. Every night I lay awake, calculating the risk of waiting against the risk of moving too soon. And every night I came to the same cold conclusion. If I moved now, with a forged certificate and a boy's whispered sentence, they would run, and Eli would disappear, and this time there would be no photograph, no doorstep, no second chance. So I waited, but I did not wait idly. I built. Elena and I established a system. She would gather, I would analyze. Every few days she would bring me a folder, and I would spread its contents across the long table in my dining room, the table where Margaret and I had eaten 10,000 dinners, and I would do the work I was born to do. I would find the shape of the lie. The trust was the center of everything, and so I made the trust my study. Frank, using entirely legitimate means, obtained the trust instrument and the accountings that the trustee was legally required to file. Vanessa, as trustee, had been required to keep records and to report. And here is a thing about people who commit fraud that took me decades to fully appreciate. They are almost never as careful as they believe. They fool the people who aren't looking, and they come to believe that no one will ever look, and they get lazy in the specific ways that a trained eye can read like a confession. Vanessa's accountings were a masterpiece of small lies. On their surface, they were unremarkable. Distributions for the beneficiary's care, medical expenses, educational expenses, housing allocated to the beneficiary's benefit, all perfectly ordinary, all supported by invoices and receipts. But I had spent 39 years reading exactly these kinds of documents, and I could feel the wrongness in them, the way you can feel a fever in a child's forehead before the thermometer confirms it. The medical expenses were the first thread. There were a great many of them, mounting steadily over the years, all consistent with a child suffering from a serious congenital heart condition, cardiology consultations, specialist visits, medications, a pattern of expensive, ongoing care for a very sick little boy. It was a beautiful lie, because it did 2 things at once. It drained money out of the trust and into Vanessa's control, under the cover of medical necessity, and it built a documentary record of a fatally ill child, laying the paper groundwork for the death that was coming. She had been writing Sammy's fake illness into the record for years before she wrote his fake death. It was patient. It was methodical. In another life, I might have admired the craftsmanship. In this one, it made me want to put my fist through the wall. But it was a lie, and lies leave edges. Elena ran down the providers named on those medical invoices, and one by one, they came apart in her hands. A cardiology practice that had no record of the patient. A pharmacy that had never filled the prescriptions billed to it. A pediatric specialist whose name was real, but whose office had never seen the child. The invoices were fabrications, printed to look legitimate, submitted into a trust accounting that no one was ever supposed to audit. Vanessa had been paying the child's medical bills to herself, through shell providers, for years. The money had never gone to any doctor. It had gone into accounts that Elena was slowly, patiently mapping. And that was where the second grandchild-shaped hole in the world began to fill in. Because if the medical care was fake, then either Sammy had never been sick, which we already suspected, or Sammy had been sick with something else entirely that no one was treating, or Sammy was simply a healthy boy whose entire medical history was an invention. And a healthy boy does not die of a heart condition he never had. So the death certificate was not just suspicious. It was, I now knew with certainty, a fabrication, built on top of a fabrication, a forged death, resting on a forged illness, all of it in service of converting a controlled trust into free money. I brought all of this to Frank, and Frank, who is a careful man, sat with it for a long time, and then he said something I have never forgotten. He said, "Nathaniel, you understand that what you're describing is not an inheritance dispute. What you're describing is fraud and forgery. And if that boy is alive and being hidden, it may be a great deal worse than that. This is not something we settle with a lawyer's letter. This is something we hand to people with badges. But we only get to do that once, and if we do it before we can prove the boy is alive and produce him safely, then all we've done is warn the people holding him. We have to be able to bring the boy home in the same motion that we bring the case. Everything at once, or nothing. Everything at once, or nothing." He was right. And so the entire strategy crystallized into a single, terrifying necessity. I could not just prove the fraud. I had to find Eli, confirm he was Samuel, get him somewhere safe, and expose everything, all in one coordinated stroke, before Vanessa and Daniel could sense the ground shifting and run with the boy into the dark. To do that, I needed to get closer. And to get closer without raising alarm, I needed my performance of decline to become an invitation. So I did something that made Elena nervous, and made Frank, briefly, furious. I reached out to my son. I wrote Daniel a letter. Elena had by now located their current address, a rented townhouse 3 states away, so I knew where to send it. But I did not write as a man who knew anything. I wrote as exactly the person I had spent weeks pretending to be. A failing old man, alone, grieving, aware that his time was short, wanting nothing more than to make peace before the end. I wrote that I did not blame him for the estrangement, that I understood people grow apart, that I was not angry. I wrote that Margaret had passed, and that her dying wish had been for our family to be whole again. I wrote that I had no one left, and that I was unwell, and that before I died, I wanted only to see my son once more, and to know my grandson if he would allow it. Every word of it was a lie in its intent, and agonizingly, the truth in its content. Margaret had died. Her wish had been for the family. I was alone, and I was, in a very real sense, dying, though not in the way I let him believe. I signed it with a shaking hand, an old man's hand, and I meant for that tremble to show on the page. And then, because I know how predators think, I added the hook. I mentioned, in passing, as if it were an afterthought of estate planning, that with Margaret gone, I had been putting my own affairs in order. That I had a good deal more than people realized, from Margaret's family, and from my own long career, and that I did not know who to leave it to, now, with the family so fractured. That I supposed it would go to Sammy, my only grandchild, when the time came. If only I could know he was being cared for. I dangled a fortune in front of a woman who could not resist a fortune. And then I waited to see if the lion's stillness would draw the herd to the water. It took 11 days. On the 12th day, my phone rang, and the voice on the other end was Vanessa's, and it was warm and gracious and full of a tender concern that I knew to be entirely manufactured, and it was the single most encouraging sound I had heard in 2 years, because it meant the trap was open and the bait had been taken. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice honeyed with false sympathy. "We were so heartbroken to hear about Margaret, and we've felt just terrible about the distance. Daniel especially. He's carried so much guilt. And your letter, it moved us both to tears. Of course you should see your grandson. Family is everything. We should never have let it get this far." I made my voice waver. I told her how much it meant to me. I let a little confusion creep in, repeated a detail I'd already said, apologized for my forgetfulness, blamed my age. I heard the tiny shift in her tone when I did that. The almost imperceptible relaxation of a predator who has just confirmed that the prey is weak. She thought she was managing a fading old man with money and no memory. She had no idea she was talking to a forensic accountant who had already reconstructed 6 years of her fraud across his dining room table. We made a plan. They would come to me, she said. It would be easier, given my health, than my traveling to them. They would bring Sammy. They would come in 3 weeks' time for a visit, and we would begin, she said, to heal. I hung up the phone, and I sat in the silence of my house, and I felt 2 things at war inside me. The first was a grief so deep I could barely breathe, because I was about to see my grandson for the first time in 7 years, a boy I had last held when he was small enough to fall asleep on my chest, and I was going to have to look at him and pretend I did not already know the crime that had been committed against him. The second was something colder and older and absolutely steady. They were coming to me, into my house, onto my ground, and they did not know that every wall of it was about to have ears, because I was not going to waste this visit. Elena and I had already discussed it. When Vanessa and Daniel came into my home, believing themselves safe, believing me harmless, they would talk. People always talk when they think they've won, and I intended to hear every word. Now, I want to be careful here, because I know some of you are lawyers or care about these things, and rightly so. Elena and Frank and I did nothing that was not lawful. I am not going to walk you through the specifics of recording law, but I will tell you that we consulted carefully, that we did everything by the book, and that in my home, in my state, I was entitled to preserve a record of conversations I was a party to. I mention this only so you understand that when the truth came out, it came out clean, admissible, unshakable. I did not spend 39 years learning how fraud gets thrown out of court, only to build a case that would collapse. Everything was going to hold. That was the entire point of the patience. Anyone can make an accusation. I was building something that could not be denied. The 3 weeks were the longest of my life, longer than the 14 weeks of Margaret's illness, because in those, I had at least been able to hold her hand. In these, I could only wait and prepare, and think about the boy on the porch, and pray in my clumsy, out-of-practice way that Eli was safe, that whatever the woman in the black car was doing to protect him was holding, that they would not sense the trap and vanish before they reached my door. They did not vanish. On a Saturday afternoon in the spring, a black sedan, the same black sedan, pulled up in front of my house, and I stood at my window, an old lion at the water's edge, still as a stone, and I watched my son get out of a car for the first time in 7 years. Daniel had aged terribly. That was the first thing I saw. He was only in his late 30s, but he moved like a man decades older, hunched, gray-faced, his eyes darting. He looked, I realized with a fresh stab of grief, exactly like a man who was afraid all the time. Whatever Vanessa was, my son had not become her partner. He had become something closer to her hostage, and I could see it in the way he flinched when she spoke, the way he looked to her before answering the simplest question. I had lost my son to this woman, as surely as if she had taken him at gunpoint. And in a way, I would later learn, she had. Vanessa got out next, and she was radiant, poised, beautiful in that careful arranged way, exactly as she had been at that long-ago Christmas. She had not aged at all. Some people don't, when nothing inside them can be touched. And then the back door opened, and a boy got out. And my heart, which I had thought was fully broken already, broke again, in an entirely new place, because it was him. It was the boy from my porch. It was Eli, 9 years old, small for his age, with Margaret's exact eyes, and he stood beside the car, looking at my house, with an expression of such careful, guarded blankness that I understood at once he had been coached, threatened, told exactly what to say and what not to say. He did not run to me. He did not show any flicker of recognition. He had been on this porch before, in the rain, and now he stood beside his mother and gave no sign of it, and I understood that this boy had learned, far too young, the single most important survival skill of a child in a dangerous house. He had learned to show nothing. I opened my door and I came out onto the porch, and I made myself small and slow and glad. I called out, in a voice thick with entirely real emotion, "Daniel, oh Daniel, son." And my boy looked at me, and for just 1 second, one single second, the fear cracked, and something underneath it showed through, something that might have been shame, or love, or the ghost of the child he had been. And then it was gone, sealed over, and he said, "Hello, Dad," in a flat voice, and looked away. Vanessa swept up the walk with her hand extended and her smile blazing. "Nathaniel," she said, "it's been far too long. And this," she said, turning, pulling the boy forward by the shoulder, "this is Sammy. Say hello to your grandfather, sweetheart." "Sammy," she called him Sammy to my face. Not Eli. Sammy. Of course she did. To me, he had always been Sammy. The name Eli was for the paperwork, for the world where Sammy Reyes was dead, and a younger boy named Eli had taken his place. Here, in front of the grandfather she was trying to charm out of his money, he was Sammy again. The audacity of it, the sheer cold theater of it, took my breath away. She was performing my dead grandson's resurrection right in front of me, and she thought I would never know the difference. I knelt down, slowly, the way I do everything, and I looked into that little boy's face, into Margaret's eyes, and I said, very gently, "Hello, Sammy. It's so good to finally see you." And the boy looked back at me, and I watched him decide, in real time, that he did not know me, that we had never met, that there had been no porch, and no rain, and no photograph. He said, in a small, careful, rehearsed voice, "Hello, sir." And then, so quickly I almost missed it, so subtly that no one watching for anything less would ever have caught it. The boy's eyes flicked down toward my hand, and back up to my face, and he gave me the smallest nod, the tiniest movement. A signal. "It's me. I know you. Play along." That brave, brilliant, terrified child was protecting the plan. My plan, which he could not possibly have known existed, and his own plan, whatever it was, the one that had put him on my porch in the rain. He had decided, in the space of a heartbeat, that the safest thing was for both of us to pretend. And he was right, and he was 9 years old. And I have never in my life been so proud of and so frightened for another human being. I stood up, my knees protesting, and I ushered them all inside my home, into the house where Margaret and I had lived our whole marriage, into the rooms that were, though they did not know it, listening. Let them come to the water, I thought. Let them come all the way in. I had prepared for the visit the way I once prepared for a deposition. Every detail was arranged to reinforce the story I wanted them to believe. There were pill bottles on the kitchen counter, arranged where they would be seen. There was a notepad by the telephone, with reminders written to myself in a shaky hand. The kind of notes a man leaves when he no longer trusts his own memory. Call Frank about the thing. Tuesday is the appointment. Turn off the stove. Small, sad, convincing details. I had left a book open and face down on the arm of my chair. The same book, in the same place, that I would leave open for 3 days, so that if anyone noticed, they would notice a man who could no longer follow a story to its end. I served them coffee and a store cake. I'd apologized for not baking myself, and I let my hands tremble as I carried the cups, and I saw Vanessa watching my hands with the quiet attention of a woman assessing an asset. I sat them in my living room, and I let the afternoon unfold slowly, and I played my part. I asked about Sammy's school, and Vanessa answered smoothly, and I saw the boy go very still. I asked about his friends, his favorite subjects, whether he played any sports, and Vanessa answered all of it, warmly, in detail, never once letting the child speak for himself, and every answer was a small performance of a normal childhood that I was now certain the boy did not have. Once I asked Sammy directly if he liked to read, because Margaret had loved to read, and I wanted to hear his voice, and before the boy could open his mouth, Vanessa said, "Oh, he's a wonderful reader, aren't you, sweetheart?" and squeezed his shoulder, and the boy said, "Yes, sir," and looked at the floor. She controlled every word that came out of that child. She could not let him speak unsupervised for 10 seconds. It told me everything about how tightly the lie was held. Daniel barely spoke at all. He sat on the edge of the sofa, like a man waiting for a sentence to be pronounced, and he looked at me with a terrible mixture of longing and dread, and every time I caught his eye, he looked away. Once, when Vanessa had gone to the kitchen, Daniel and I were alone for a moment, and I looked at my son, and I let my performance drop, just slightly, just for him, and I said, very quietly, "Are you all right, son?" And for a moment, Daniel's face crumpled like a child's, and I thought he might break, might tell me everything right there. But then Vanessa's heels sounded in the hallway, and Daniel's face slammed shut, and he said, loudly, in a hollow voice, "We're doing great, Dad, really great," and the moment was gone. But I had seen it. My son was drowning, and some part of him, I understood, had wanted me to see. The afternoon wore into evening. I had told them, when they arranged the visit, that I hoped they would stay the night, that I had rooms enough, that I hated the thought of them driving so far after such a short visit. It was part of the trap. I needed them under my roof after dark, comfortable, unguarded, believing the old man was asleep. And Vanessa, calculating that a longer stay meant more time to work on the fortune she believed was in play, had agreed. I made a show of tiring early. I yawned. I lost my thread mid-sentence. I apologized and said I was not what I used to be, that I needed to lie down, that they should make themselves at home. I bid them all good night. I went slowly up the stairs, an old man going to bed, and I closed my bedroom door. And then I sat down in the dark, fully dressed, in a chair by the door, and I waited, and I listened. It did not take long. Predators, when they believe themselves unobserved, cannot help but preen. I had counted on it. Below me, through the old floors of that house, I heard the murmur of their voices change. The performance was over. The guest smiles were put away. I could not hear every word from my room, but I did not need to, because I had done more than sit and hope. In the living room and the kitchen, placed lawfully in my own home, were devices that missed nothing. I did not have to strain. I only had to wait, and later, listen to it all, clean and clear. But I will tell you what I heard that night, in the dark, drifting up through the floor, because some of it reached me even without the recordings, and it is burned into my memory. I heard Vanessa laugh, a real laugh, this time, not the honeyed performance from the afternoon, a low, satisfied, private laugh, and I heard her say, clearly enough that it carried, "He's completely gone. Did you see him with the pills? He doesn't know what day it is." And I heard her say, "This is going to be even easier than the last one." The last one, her second husband, the one who had died, whose children had contested it and lost. This is going to be even easier than the last one. I sat in the dark, and I felt the hair rise on my arms. I heard Daniel's voice, low and miserable, saying something I couldn't make out, a question, a protest, and I heard Vanessa's voice go sharp and cold, the honey gone entirely, and she said, "Don't you start. Don't you dare start with me now. We are so close. You want to go back to how it was before? You want them to find out about Sammy? Because that's a prison cell, Daniel. That's a prison cell for both of us. So you'll smile, and you'll play the loving son, and when the old man dies you'll cry at the funeral, and then we will finally be done. Do you understand me?" And I heard my son say, in a voice with nothing left in it, "I understand. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I had to." My daughter-in-law had just confirmed, in my own house, 3 things I had only been able to prove on paper. That she intended to defraud and, I now understood, likely to kill me for my money, the way she had killed before. That my son knew and was too broken or too complicit to stop it, and that whatever they had done to Sammy was, in her own words, a prison cell for both of them if it ever came to light. That's a prison cell. She did not say scandal. She did not say lawsuit. She said prison. You do not go to prison for hiding a living child under a false name, unless that hiding is wrapped inside something much larger and much worse. I sat in that chair all night. I did not sleep. And near dawn I heard one more thing, the thing that changed everything, the thing that turned this from a story about a stolen inheritance into something that I still, to this day, cannot think about without my hands going cold. I heard, very faintly, from the room where they had put the boy, a sound. It was the boy. He was awake, and he was crying, very quietly, the way a child cries when he has learned that crying loudly is dangerous. And I heard Vanessa's footsteps cross to that room, and I heard the door, and I heard her voice, low and vicious, and she said something to that little boy that I will carry to my own grave. She said, "If you say one word to that old man, one word, you'll go where the last one went. You want to go where the other Sammy went? The other Sammy." I stopped breathing. The other Sammy. You want to go where the other Sammy went. And in that instant, sitting in the dark in the house where I had raised my family, I understood the true and full and monstrous shape of what my son and his wife had done, and it was so much worse than fraud, so much worse than a forged death certificate, so much worse than anything I had let myself imagine. And I understood why Vanessa had said prison. And I understood why the woman in the black car had been so afraid. And I understood that the boy sleeping down the hall from me was not the boy I thought he was, and was in the most dangerous place a child could possibly be. There had been 2 boys. I will not dramatize this part beyond what it is, because it does not need it, and because a real child is at the center of it. But you deserve to understand what I came to understand in the days that followed, once Elena and Frank and, eventually, the authorities had assembled the whole terrible picture. I am going to tell it to you plainly. My grandson, the real Samuel Reyes, Margaret's Sammy, the boy with her eyes, had been a healthy, living child, but he had also been, on paper, a very sick one, because Vanessa had spent years fabricating his illness to drain the trust. And at a certain point, that fabricated illness had become inconvenient in a new way, because a child who is supposed to be dying eventually has to either recover, which raises questions, or die, which triggers the trust. Vanessa had chosen death. On paper, she had filed the forged certificate. She had collected, or begun to collect, on the contingency. Sammy Reyes was legally dead, and a fortune was flowing. But there was still a living boy, and a living boy who is legally dead is a problem. He cannot go to school under his real name. He cannot exist in any record. He is a loose thread that can unravel everything, with a single sentence, to the wrong adult. And so Vanessa had done what she did to every inconvenient thing in her life. She had made it disappear and replaced it with something more useful. She had given the living boy a new name, Eli, and a younger age on forged paper, and had begun raising him as a different, unrelated child, a nephew, a ward, a foster placement. The story shifted depending on who was asking. The dead Sammy paid out the trust. The living Eli was the boy, renamed, hidden, controlled, and threatened into silence. That much I had already largely deduced. That was the fraud, monstrous as it was. But the thing I heard through the floor that night, "You want to go where the other Sammy went," told me there was a second child in this story, and that second child is the reason this case is one that the authorities pursued with everything they had. Because the boy who had come to my porch, the boy sleeping down the hall, the boy Vanessa, was now calling Sammy to my face, and Eli on paper was not, it would turn out, Margaret's grandson at all. He was a different child entirely. And the real Samuel Reyes, Margaret's Sammy, the boy with her eyes, was the other Sammy, the one who had gone where Vanessa was threatening to send this boy. I told you I would tell it plainly, and I will, though it is the hardest thing in this entire account to say. The real Samuel Reyes had died, not on the forged certificate's terms, not of a heart condition he never had, but he had died, years earlier, in circumstances that Vanessa had buried so completely that even the fraud built on top of it had a different, fictional death stacked over the real one. When Elena and the investigators finally exhumed the whole truth, they found that Margaret's Sammy had died young, and that his death had never been honestly reported, and that Vanessa had realized she could not simply let the beneficiary of a multi-million-dollar trust vanish without triggering scrutiny she wasn't ready for. And so she had done the unthinkable. She had found another child, a boy of roughly the right age, from a chaotic situation where he would not be missed, a boy she could pass off as Sammy when Sammy needed to appear alive, and rename as Eli when Sammy needed to appear dead. One child, doing the work of a ghost, alive when the trust needed him alive, dead when the trust paid more that way. And underneath it all, the real grandson, Margaret's grandson, gone, unmourned, unburied honestly, erased so thoroughly that his own grandfather had spent 2 years knitting adjacent grief for a boy who had been dead longer than anyone knew. I had to stop writing this account for a full day when I reached this part. I am an old man, and I have seen the worst that people do with money, 39 years of it, and I had never seen anything like this, and it was inside my own family, and the woman who did it was asleep under my roof. The boy down the hall, the brave boy on the porch, was a victim too. A stolen child, given a dead boy's name, threatened with a dead boy's fate. When he had whispered to me on the porch, "They lie about everything," he had meant it more literally and more terribly than I could have known. He did not fully understand what had happened to the first Sammy, but he understood that boys who talked disappeared, and he understood that he was supposed to be a boy who did not exist, and he had found, somewhere in that house, a photograph of a smiling old couple on a wedding day, with a name written on the back, and he had done the bravest thing I have ever known a child to do. He had decided that a dead grandfather was his only hope, and he had run to find him. Now do you understand why Vanessa said prison? Now do you understand the fear in the woman in the black car? And now, perhaps, you understand what happened to me in that dark room before dawn. Because I had come into this to keep a promise to Margaret. Find the boy, so he knows he was loved. And I had learned that the boy she meant was already gone, had been gone for years, and that a different, living, breathing, terrified child was now sleeping down the hall, in mortal danger, wearing my grandson's name like a borrowed coat. The promise changed shape in that room. Margaret's Sammy Dunn. I could not save. No one could, now. But I could see him honestly mourned, and honestly named, and I could see the people who had done this answer for it in full. And the living boy, the one on the porch, the one who had run to a dead man for help, that boy I could still save. That boy I would save, if it was the last thing I did on this earth. And at 71, with what I was about to walk into, it very nearly was. I did not confront them that night. Everything in me wanted to. Everything in me wanted to walk down those stairs and put my hands around that woman's throat. But I was an old lion, not a young one, and the old lion's whole strength is that he does not move until the moment is exact. If I confronted them now, in this house, alone, an old man against a woman who had killed before, and a son too broken to help, I would accomplish nothing but my own death and the boy's disappearance. I had a recording, but a recording alone was not the boy home safe. Everything at once, or nothing. Frank's words. I held on to them like a railing in the dark. So I did the second hardest thing in this whole account. When morning came, I went downstairs, and I smiled, and I made them breakfast, and I played the gentle failing grandfather, while a woman who had threatened to murder a child sat at Margaret's table and ate Margaret's recipe and smiled back at me. I asked Sammy if he wanted more eggs. I told a rambling story about Margaret that lost its own thread. I let Vanessa believe, right up until the moment they drove away, that she had spent the night in the home of a harmless old man who was going to leave her a fortune and then conveniently die. And when the black car pulled away from my curb, with that brave boy in the back seat looking out the rear window at me with an expression I could not read, I stood on my porch and I raised one hand, an old man waving goodbye, and under my breath I made the boy a promise he could not hear. I said, "Hold on, son, just a little longer. I'm coming for you, and this time I am bringing everyone." Then I went inside, and I called Elena, and I called Frank, and I told them what I had heard, and there was a long silence on each call, the silence of people absorbing something that rearranges the world. And then all three of us went to work, because the waiting was over. Now there was only the closing of the trap, and it had to be perfect, because we would only get to spring it once, and a child's life was inside it. The woman in the black car was the key that opened the last locked door, and I want to tell you who she was, because she is, to my mind, the second bravest person in this entire story, after the boy himself. Elena had been trying to identify her since the night of the porch. A woman, 30s or 40s, driving a black sedan, who had brought a hidden child to a stranger's door, and then, when the child ran to that door, had called him back, not with anger, but with fear. I had insisted from the beginning that this woman was not our enemy, and Elena, who trusted evidence over instinct, had reserved judgment. But the evidence, when it came, proved me right. Her name was Paige, and she was Vanessa's younger sister. I need to give you a moment to absorb that, because I certainly needed one. The woman who had risked everything to bring that boy to me was the sister of the woman who had orchestrated the entire nightmare. Paige had been, for years, on the outer edge of Vanessa's life, kept at a careful distance, told only what Vanessa wanted her to know. But sisters see things, and Paige had begun, slowly, over years, to see. Elena found Paige the way she found everyone, patiently, through the paper and the periphery, and when she finally made contact, carefully, obliquely, testing, Paige did not run. Paige had been waiting, it turned out, for someone to come. She had been waiting for years, trapped in the same fear that trapped everyone in Vanessa's orbit, knowing something was terribly wrong, and not knowing how to prove it, or who to tell, or whether telling would only get the child hurt. I met Paige myself, once, before the end, in a diner far from anywhere, with Elena beside me. She was thin and tired, and she flinched at sudden movements, the same way Daniel did, the same way the boy did. Vanessa marked everyone she touched with that flinch. And Paige told me her piece of the truth, and it filled in the last gaps, and I am going to tell it to you the way she told it to me, plainly, because Paige had spent too long being silent, and she deserves to have her account heard. Paige had suspected for a long time that the child in Vanessa's house was not who Vanessa claimed. The stories never matched. First there had been a boy, Vanessa, called her son, Sammy, and Paige had met him a few times when he was small. Margaret's Sammy, a sweet, healthy boy. And then, over a period Paige couldn't pin down, that boy had simply stopped being present. Vanessa's explanations shifted. He was sick, he was away, he was with specialists, he was at a special school. And then, later, there was a boy again, but a different boy, younger, whom Vanessa sometimes called Sammy and sometimes called Eli, depending on who was in the room, and whom she kept away from everyone. Paige had asked, once, directly, where the first boy had gone, and Vanessa had looked at her with a coldness that Paige said she had never forgotten, and had told her never to ask that question again. And Paige, who knew her sister, who knew what her sister was capable of, had understood that the question itself was dangerous, and had stopped asking, and had hated herself for stopping. But she had not been able to stop watching the second boy, Eli. She had seen how he was treated, seen the fear in him, seen the way he had learned to make himself invisible, and she had begun, quietly, to plan. She could not go to the police with nothing but suspicion, because she had no proof, and because she was terrified that if she moved and failed, Vanessa would make the boy disappear the way the first boy had disappeared. She was one frightened woman against a sister who had, Paige was now certain, killed at least twice. So Paige had done the only thing she could think of. She had looked for an ally, and she had found one, in the most unlikely place, because the boy had found it first. Eli, it turned out, had discovered the wedding photograph on his own. He had been snooping, as children do, in a box of Vanessa's things, looking for anything that might tell him who he really was, because even at 8 years old, he knew that the story he'd been given was a lie. And he had found the photograph of Margaret and me, and on the back, in Margaret's handwriting, were our names and the words the beginning of the family. And the boy, clever and desperate, had shown it to the one adult in his life who was ever kind to him, Paige, and had asked her who these people were. And Paige had recognized us. She had met me once, years before, at Daniel and Vanessa's wedding, and she had known, looking at that photograph in that child's hands, that here at last was a thread that led somewhere outside Vanessa's control. A grandfather, a man with standing, with a claim, with a reason to fight. A man who, if he learned the truth, would never stop. But she also knew that Vanessa had told the boy his grandparents were dead. That was the wall. So Paige had made a decision that I think about often, because it was both a lie and the truest thing she could have done. She had not corrected the boy's belief that we were dead. Instead, she had used it. She had told Eli, quietly, that even though these people were gone, sometimes when you have lost everyone, the bravest thing you can do is go to the place they lived and knock on the door, because you never know who might be there now, who might help you. She had planted the idea. And then, on a rainy night when Vanessa was distracted and an opportunity opened, Paige had taken the boy and driven him the long miles to my address, the address from the back of the photograph and from her own memory of the wedding, and she had let him walk up to my door alone, because she needed him to be the one to make contact. needed his face and his eyes and his voice to do what no accusation of hers ever could, and because if it went wrong, she could still call him back and claim it was nothing, a wrong turn, a confused child. That was the porch. That was the rain. That was the black car with its lights off. Paige had brought the boy to me, and then, when it worked, when I opened the door, she had panicked at the enormity of what she'd set in motion, and had called him back before he could say too much, and had driven away terrified that she had just signed the boy's death warrant if Vanessa ever found out. She had spent the weeks since in agony, not knowing if I had understood, not knowing if I would act, not knowing if she had saved the boy or doomed him. And then Elena had made contact, carefully, and Paige had realized that the grandfather had understood, that the grandfather was not dead, was not fooled, was not harmless, and was building something. And Paige had wept with relief, she told me, for the first time in years. Paige became the inside. With her help, everything accelerated. She could tell us Vanessa's movements, her habits, the layout of the house, where the boy slept, when he was watched, and when he wasn't. She could confirm, from her own direct knowledge, the timeline of the two boys, and crucially, she was willing, when the time came, to testify, to stand up in the light and say what she knew about her own sister. That is a kind of courage I am not sure I possess, and I have thought about it often. But her testimony, and my recording, and my reconstruction of the fraud, and Elena's investigation, were still only pieces. We needed to assemble them into a single stroke that would do three things simultaneously: expose the fraud and the crimes beyond any possible denial, deliver the whole of it to the authorities, in a form they could act on instantly, and, above all, before Vanessa could sense the walls closing and vanish with the boy, get Eli physically safe. Frank brought in the authorities carefully, at exactly the right moment, not a day too soon. He and Elena had spent his career's worth of relationships making sure that when we walked in, we would be believed. And we did not walk in with a story. We walked in with a case. The forged medical invoices, traced to their fake providers. The forged death certificate, disproven at every point. The trust language showing the motive in black and white. The financial trail Elena and I had reconstructed, showing where the money had actually gone. My recording from the night in my house, in which Vanessa confessed, in her own voice, to defrauding me, to threatening the boy, and, in that one shattering sentence, to the fate of the first Sammy. And Paige, the sister, willing to testify to all of it from the inside. When the investigators heard the recording, one of them, a woman who had worked crimes against children for 2 decades, had to leave the room. I saw her go. I understood. They moved fast, then, and they moved carefully, because the single most important thing, the thing all of us held above every other consideration, was the boy's safety. A raid that spooked Vanessa into flight with the child, or worse, was the one outcome we could not allow. So it was planned like the delicate operation it was. And the decision was made to spring the whole trap at a moment when the boy could be secured, and Vanessa and Daniel could be taken in the same instant, in public, with no warning and no room to run. That moment came, and I will tell you about it. And it is the moment the whole long, patient wait had been building toward. But before I do, I want to say one thing. Vanessa had spent years believing she was the most dangerous thing in every room she entered. She believed it about her husbands, about her sister, about her son, about the children she used and discarded, and finally about me, the failing old grandfather, with the shaking hands and the pills on the counter. She was so certain of her own supremacy that she walked directly into a house she thought was empty of any threat and confessed her crimes into its walls. She had never learned the thing that Margaret knew about people, the thing 39 years of forensic work had taught me. That the quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who do not chase, are not harmless. They are simply waiting. The old lion at the water's edge is the most dangerous animal on the whole plain, and the reason the herd never fears him is the exact reason he never fails. He does not move until it is time, and then he does not miss. It was time. I want to slow down here and tell you about the weeks of preparation before the end, because they were, in a strange way, the truest work of my life, and because I think there is something in them worth understanding about what patience actually costs. People imagine that waiting is passive. It is not. Waiting, done correctly, is the most active thing there is. Every day of those weeks, Elena and I sat at Margaret's dining table, and we built the case one verifiable fact at a time, and every fact had to be checked, and cross-checked, and sourced, and made bulletproof, because I knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how a case like this could be broken. I had spent my career breaking them. I had sat on the other side, as the expert who found the flaw, the unsupported assumption, the document that couldn't be authenticated, the chain of custody that had a gap in it. I knew every way a guilty person walks free, because I had watched it happen, and I was not going to let it happen here. So we were merciless with ourselves. Every invoice that proved the fake medical care, we traced to its origin and confirmed the provider was fictitious, and then we confirmed it a second way. Every dollar we followed all the way, from the trust account into the shell, from the shell into the next account, until we could stand in front of anyone and show the whole path with no leaps of faith required. The forged death certificate, we did not merely assert was false. We proved it false from 4 independent directions, so that no single explanation could rescue it. The clinic that had closed before the signing date, the hospital with no record, the physician whose signature did not match his genuine one, the medical impossibility of a heart condition in a boy his own great-grandmother, a nurse, had examined and found healthy. 4 locks on one door. And the recording. The recording was the heart of it, and I handled it with the care it deserved. I did not edit it. I did not enhance it in any way that could be challenged. It was what it was, complete and unbroken, Vanessa's own voice, in my own home, saying the words that would end her. He's completely gone. This is going to be even easier than the last one. You want to go where the other Sammy went, in her voice. There is no expert on earth who can explain those words into innocence. I confess there were nights I doubted. Not the case was sound. I doubted whether I would live to see it finished. I was 71 years old, and I was carrying a weight that would have taxed a much younger man, and I could feel it in my chest and my joints, and the deep gray tiredness that came over me some afternoons. I would look at the photograph of Margaret on the desk, and I would say to her, out loud, in the empty house, I'm trying, Margaret. I'm so tired, but I'm trying. And somehow, saying it to her, I would find the next morning's strength. Grief is a strange fuel, but it burns a long time. There was a particular night, perhaps 10 days before the end, when I nearly made a fatal mistake, and I tell you about it because I think honesty requires it. Paige called me, frightened, and told me that Vanessa had grown agitated, that she had been talking about moving again, about leaving the state, that something had spooked her, and my heart seized, because if Vanessa ran now, with the boy, before we were ready, we would lose everything. And in that moment of fear, every instinct in me screamed to move immediately, to call the authorities that very night, and send them in, to end it before she could flee. It was Elena who stopped me. She said, Nathaniel, listen to me. If we move tonight, unprepared, in a panic, We will do exactly what she's counting on. Frightened people make mistakes, and she is trying to frighten us into one. We are not ready. The boy is not secured. If we send people to that house tonight, and it goes wrong, that child pays the price, not us. Hold. Trust the plan. The old lion does not move because the herd got nervous. He moves because it is time. She was right. She used my own metaphor against my own fear. And she was right. I held. And it turned out that Vanessa's agitation was just that, agitation. The restlessness of a predator who senses something without knowing what. She did not run. She could not quite bring herself to abandon the fortune she believed was so close. Her own greed was the leash that held her in place long enough. And I learned, that night, the final lesson of patience, which is that patience is hardest precisely at the end, in the last stretch, when everything in you is screaming to finish, and that the discipline to hold in that final stretch is the whole difference between winning and losing. I also spent those weeks doing something that had nothing to do with the case, and everything to do with the promise. I prepared a place for the boy. I did not know, in any legal sense, whether I would ever be permitted to care for Eli. He was not my blood, we now knew. The legal situation was a thicket that Frank warned me would take a long time to resolve, and might not resolve in my favor at all, given my age. But I could not help myself. I cleaned out the small bedroom at the end of the hall, the one that had once been Daniel's, and I painted it, slowly, over several days, a warm, pale blue, because Margaret had always said that blue was a peaceful color for a child's room. I bought books, the ones Margaret had loved, the ones we had once imagined reading to a grandchild. I did not let myself hope too hard, but I could not stop my hands from getting ready. An old man, painting a child's room, not knowing if the child would ever sleep in it. There is a particular kind of foolish, stubborn love in that, and I was full of it, and I make no apology. Elena, meanwhile, had turned up the last dark corner of Vanessa's history, and it confirmed the pattern beyond any doubt. The second husband, the one who had died, the one whose children had contested it and lost. Elena, with the resources now assembling behind our case, was able to look again at that death with fresh eyes, and what she found was that it bore the same signature as everything else: a vulnerable person, a position of trust and control, a fabricated record built patiently over time, and then a death that paid out, ruled natural, by people who were not looking closely, because no one had given them a reason to look closely. Vanessa had a method, and the method had worked twice, and she had every reason to believe it would work a third time on the failing old grandfather. She did not understand that this time someone had been looking closely from the very first day. That was her single fatal miscalculation, and it was the miscalculation of every predator who has ever mistaken quiet for weakness. Elena did one more thing in those final weeks that I have never adequately thanked her for, and it deserves to be recorded here. She found the truth about the first Sammy's death, and she did it with a care and a gentleness that the task demanded. This was the hardest corner of the entire investigation, because it meant establishing what had happened to a child years earlier, a child whose death had never been honestly recorded, whose passing had been swallowed by the same machinery of lies that Vanessa used to swallow everything inconvenient. Elena approached it the way she approached everything, patiently, from the edges. She traced the periods of the boy's life through school records that started and then abruptly stopped, through a pediatrician's file that ended without explanation, through the small administrative footprints that even a hidden child leaves in the world. And slowly, painfully, she assembled a timeline of Margaret's Sammy, a real boy who had lived a real, if increasingly constrained life, and whose presence in the world simply ceased at a certain point, replaced first by the fiction of a dying child, and then by the substitution of another boy entirely. When Elena laid it all out for me, she did it kindly, and she gave me time, and she did not force me to look at anything I did not need to see. But she made sure I understood the shape of it, because I had to, and because the authorities would need me to be able to bear witness to the family history that framed it all. Margaret's Sammy had died, and his death had been concealed, and the concealment had been the seed from which the entire subsequent fraud had grown. Vanessa had faced a problem, a dead beneficiary whose death, honestly reported, would have triggered scrutiny of the trust and the circumstances, scrutiny she could not survive. And so she had chosen concealment over disclosure, a substitute child over the truth, layer over layer over layer, until the original crime was buried beneath so much fabrication that she must have believed it could never be found. She reckoned, without a retired forensic accountant, and a retired detective, and a brave little boy, and a frightened sister, who finally found her courage. The truth was down there, at the bottom of all the lies, and we went down and got it. I asked Elena, once, near the end, how she did this work, how she looked at these things, year after year, and did not break, and she said something I have thought about often since. She said, "Nathaniel, I do it because someone has to be willing to look. Predators count on no one looking. That's their whole method. And every time one of us is willing to look, all the way, no matter how dark, we take that method away from them. That's the job. Not finding the darkness, refusing to look away from it." I understood exactly what she meant, because it was the same reason I had spent 39 years reading documents other people had built specifically to be unreadable. Someone has to be willing to look. It is, perhaps, the whole of what I have to offer the world, and I offered all of it, one last time, for that boy. The picture, by the end, was complete, and it was damning, and it was airtight. Financial fraud spanning years, forgery of official documents, the theft, effectively, of an entire trust through a fabricated death, the abduction and false identification of a living child. And beneath it all, the two deaths, the husband and the first Sammy, that transformed the whole matter from a financial crime into something the authorities would pursue to the ends of the earth. And so we came to the plan for the end, and I will tell you how we chose to do it, because the manner of it mattered to me a great deal. I could have let it happen quietly. The authorities could have arrested Vanessa and Daniel in a parking lot, or at their home in the dark, and it would have been safer and simpler. But I wanted two things that a quiet arrest could not give me. I wanted the boy secured, absolutely and above all. And I wanted the truth to come out in the light, in the open, in front of witnesses, because Vanessa had done all of her evil in the dark, in whispers, in forged papers, and locked rooms, and threats made to a child in the night, and I wanted her undone, in the exact opposite of the conditions she had chosen. I wanted her exposed in daylight, in public, with everyone watching, not for cruelty, for truth. Some lies are so deep that they can only be broken in the open, where they cannot be whispered away. The opportunity, when it came, was almost too fitting. Vanessa, believing the old grandfather was near death and the fortune near to falling into her hands, had proposed a second visit. This time, she suggested, at a nice restaurant, a proper family dinner, to celebrate the healing of our family. She wanted, I understood, to be seen being loving, to build the record of the devoted daughter-in-law who would soon inherit, to have witnesses to her tenderness for the doddering old man. She chose the venue herself, a well-known restaurant, the kind of place with a private dining room, and she chose a date, and she assumed she was arranging the stage for her own performance. She was arranging the stage, but not for her performance. Frank and Elena and the authorities and I planned it to the minute. the private dining room. The boy, who Vanessa would of course bring, because bringing Sammy was central to her charade of family. Paige, who had, at terrible risk, arranged to be invited, positioned to be near the boy, to be the trusted adult who would move him to safety the instant it began. And, throughout the restaurant, unremarkable people, at unremarkable tables, who were not what they appeared to be. The whole of it would spring at a single signal. The moment the boy was clear, everything would move at once. I did not sleep the night before. I sat in my study, with Margaret's photograph, and I told her that tomorrow I was going to keep my promise, all of it, the part she had asked for, and the part I had added, on the night I heard the truth through the floor. I told her that her Sammy would be honestly mourned at last, and that the ones who did it would answer for all of it, and that a brave, stolen boy would be pulled out of the dark. And I asked her, the way I still ask her about everything, to help me hold steady one more day, one last day, at the water's edge. In the morning, I put on my good suit, the charcoal one Margaret had liked, and I looked at myself in the mirror, a 71-year-old man with shaking hands, and I did not look dangerous at all, and I thought, good. Let me not look dangerous. Let me look like exactly what she thinks I am, right up until the last second. Then I drove to the restaurant to have dinner with the woman who was planning to murder me, and to end her. The private dining room was warm and softly lit, with a long table and heavy chairs, and the low murmur of the main restaurant beyond the door. I arrived first, on purpose. I wanted to be seated when they came in, wanted to be the frail old man rising slowly to greet them, wanted every advantage that came from being underestimated. Frank was with me, introduced as my attorney and friend. There, I told Vanessa when she asked, to help me with some estate matters over dinner, since my memory was not what it was, and I wanted him to help me remember what we discussed. Vanessa's eyes had lit up at that, at the word estate, at the confirmation that tonight was about the money. She had no idea that Frank was there for a different kind of estate matter entirely. They arrived together. Vanessa, radiant in a dark red dress, playing the devoted daughter-in-law to the hilt, kissing my cheek, telling me how wonderful I looked, how happy she was that our family was healing. Daniel, gray and hunched and silent, his eyes finding mine for a moment, with that same drowning look, before sliding away, and the boy, Eli, in a small collared shirt that was slightly too big for him, his hair combed, his face carefully blank, standing close to his mother, because he had learned that was safest. And Paige, arriving a few minutes later, greeting her sister with a nervous warmth that Vanessa accepted without suspicion, because Vanessa had never once imagined that her frightened little sister could be a threat. We sat. We ordered. Vanessa performed. She told stories about the family, invented warm memories, laughed her honeyed laugh, laid her hand over mine on the table, and told me how much these years apart had grieved her, how she had prayed for reconciliation. I played my part in return. I was moved, I was grateful, I was a little confused, I repeated myself, I let Frank gently remind me of things. And all the while, across the table, the boy sat very still and ate very little and did not look at me, because he was the bravest, smartest child I have ever known, and he was protecting the plan he could feel but could not see. At a certain point, Vanessa steered the conversation, delicately, expertly, toward the matter of my will. She did it beautifully, I will give her that, wrapping it in concern for my well-being, in wanting to make sure I was taken care of, in gentle worry about who would look after my affairs. And she raised the subject of Sammy, of course, of little Sammy's future, of how she only wanted to be sure her son was provided for, and she looked at the boy with a tenderness so convincing that a stranger would have wept at it. She was, in that moment, building the last brick of her own record, the loving mother securing her sick, precious son's inheritance from his doting, dying grandfather. And I decided that was the moment. Because Paige had, a few minutes before, under the pretense of taking the boy to wash his hands, quietly moved him. He was out of the room. He was clear. He was with the people who would keep him safe. His chair sat empty, and Vanessa, absorbed in her own performance, had not yet noticed, or had assumed he would return. I looked at that empty chair, and then I looked at Vanessa, and I let the frailty fall away from my face, the way you set down a heavy bag you have been carrying a long way. And I saw her notice it. I saw the exact instant she registered that something had changed in the old man's eyes, that the confusion was gone, that a different person was looking at her, and I saw the first flicker of true uncertainty cross her face, perhaps the first she had felt in years. I said, in my ordinary voice, my clear voice, the voice I had hidden from her for months, "Vanessa, before we discuss my will, I think we should discuss yours. Or rather, the trust, Rosalind's trust, the one you administer for the benefit of my grandson." The room went very quiet. Vanessa's smile stayed fixed, but her eyes had gone hard and searching. Daniel had gone white. I said, "I spent 39 years as a forensic accountant. Vanessa, did Daniel never tell you that? 39 years finding the truth under the numbers. I retired, but a man doesn't lose the eye, and I have spent these last months looking very closely at that trust. At the medical invoices for a boy who was never sick, billed to clinics that don't exist, and pharmacies that never filled them. At the death certificate for my grandson Samuel, signed by a doctor at a clinic that had closed 8 months before, filed with a hospital that has no record of him, for a heart condition that a pediatric nurse, his own great-grandmother, would have found the first time she held him. I have followed the money, Vanessa, all of it, every dollar, from the trust, through the accounts, to you. I know exactly what you took, and I can prove every cent of it, 4 different ways." Vanessa's face had become a mask. She said, very carefully, her voice low, "I don't know what you think you've found, but you're a confused old man, and this is slander, and we are leaving." She began to rise. And I said the thing that stopped her, the thing that pinned her to her chair. I said, "Sit down, Vanessa, because I haven't gotten to the part I heard in my own house, with my own ears, when you thought I was a doddering old fool asleep upstairs. I heard you say this was going to be even easier than the last one. I heard you tell my son that if the truth about Sammy came out, it was a prison cell for both of you. And I heard you go into that little boy's room in the middle of the night, and I heard you tell him that if he said one word to me, he would go where the other Sammy went." The color drained entirely from Vanessa's face, and Daniel, my son, my broken son, made a sound I had never heard a grown man make, a sound of pure anguish, and put his face in his hands. I said, "There were 2 boys, weren't there, Vanessa? My grandson, Margaret's Sammy, the real one. And then the other one, the living one, the one you renamed and hid and threatened, the one who is not here right now because I made very sure, before I said a single word to you, that he was somewhere you can never reach him again." Vanessa's eyes went to the empty chair, and I watched the whole thing collapse behind her face. The calculation, the certainty, the years of control, all of it giving way at once to the understanding that she had walked into a trap built by the one person she had been too arrogant to fear. She lunged, not at me, but for the door, and that was the signal, and that was the moment the room changed. Because the door opened, and the unremarkable people from the unremarkable tables were not unremarkable at all, and they came in with badges and quiet authority, and the private dining room that Vanessa had chosen as the stage for her own triumph became instead the place where it ended. I will not pretend I remember every word of what was said, the identifications, the rites read aloud, the careful, controlled procedure of it. I remember Vanessa's face, the mask finally and fully gone, and underneath it, for the first time, something small and cornered and afraid. I remember that she did not go quietly, that she said my name like a curse, that she looked at me with a hatred so pure it should have burned. And I remember that I looked back at her, an old man in his good suit, and I felt no triumph, only a deep and weary steadiness. And I said the only thing I said to her at the end. I said, "You thought I was harmless because I was quiet. Margaret tried to warn you, that first Christmas. She said you were measuring the house. She was right about you from the very first day. She was right about everything. And then they took her out, and they took Daniel too, my son, who did not resist, who went with his head down and tears streaming silently, and who paused as he passed me and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, 'I'm sorry, Dad. I couldn't. I was so afraid of her. I'm sorry.' And I put my hand on my son's shoulder, one last time, and I did not have any words for him, because I loved him, and he had let this happen, and both of those things were true at once, and neither one erased the other. And then he was gone too. The room emptied. Frank sat beside me and put his hand on my arm and said nothing, which was exactly right. And after a while, a door at the side of the room opened, and Paige came in, holding the hand of a small boy in a shirt that was slightly too big for him. And the boy looked around the empty room, at the overturned chair, at the absence of the woman who had ruled his whole life through fear, and then he looked at me. And I knelt down, slowly, the way I do everything, my old knees aching against the floor, and I opened my arms, and I said, "Hello, Sammy. Except that's not really your name, is it? What is your name, son? Your real one, the one that's just yours." And the boy looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face, some wall that had been built brick by brick over a whole young lifetime of fear, came down, and he said, very quietly, "My name is Eli." I said, "Then hello, Eli. My name is Nathaniel. I'm not your grandfather by blood. I know that now. But I made a promise to my wife, whose eyes you have somehow, that I would find a boy and make sure he knew he was loved. And I think, maybe, that boy was always going to be you. Would you like to come here, Eli? You're safe now. You're completely safe. Nobody is ever going to send you anywhere, ever again." And that brave boy, who had run to a dead man's house in the rain, who had protected a plan he couldn't see, who had endured more than any child should ever have to endure, crossed the room and put his arms around my neck and held on, and finally, allowed himself to cry the way a child is supposed to be able to cry, loudly, without fear, into the shoulder of someone who would not let go. And I held him, an old lion at the end of a very long hunt, and over his small, shaking shoulder, I looked up toward a ceiling and past it, the way you do when you are talking to someone who isn't there, and I said, without making a sound, "I found him, Margaret. I found him. He knows now." That was the end of the dark part of the story. But it was not the end of the story. Because what came after mattered just as much, and I want to tell you about it, because you have come this far with me, and you deserve to know how it all came to rest. Justice, when it came, was slow, the way it always is, but it was complete. Vanessa was charged with everything, and the case against her was exactly as unshakable as I had built it to be. The financial fraud, the forgery, the theft from the trust, the crimes against the children, and, in time, as the investigation Elena had reopened bore its full fruit, the two deaths, my grandson and the second husband, which were the gravest charges of all. She fought it, of course. Predators always fight. But there is no fighting your own voice on a recording. No explaining away a fortune traced, dollar by dollar, into your own accounts. No talking your way past 4 independent proofs that a death certificate is a forgery. No surviving the testimony of your own sister, who watched it all, and finally, bravely, refused to be silent any longer. Vanessa was convicted on the full range of charges. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will die behind bars, and she will die there for what she did to 2 children and to everyone who ever trusted her. And I have made my peace with feeling nothing about that, except that it is correct. Daniel's case was different, and it broke my heart in a different way. My son had not been the architect of any of it. He had been, the evidence showed clearly, a man captured young by a woman who dominated and terrified him, drawn step by step into complicity, too weak and too afraid to break free or to protect anyone, including himself. That is not innocence. He knew. He let a child be harmed. He let his own mother go to her grave without knowing her grandson was dead. He will carry that, and he should. But it is not the same as being the one who did it, and the court saw that distinction, and so did I. Daniel cooperated fully once Vanessa was in custody. Once the spell of his fear was finally broken. He told the whole truth, all of it, and his testimony helped seal the case against her. He was convicted of his own real crimes, the fraud he had participated in, and the failures to report what he knew, and he was sentenced to 11 years. 11 years. One for each year that Margaret and I were cut off from a grandson who, we would learn, had died somewhere in the middle of them. I visit my son. I have decided that I will. He is still my son. Whatever else is true, that is also true, and I am too old and have lost too much to throw away the one child I have left, broken as he is. We are slowly, painfully, learning how to be father and son again. Across a table, under fluorescent lights, one visit at a time. I do not know if we will finish that work before I die, but I have decided to spend the time I have trying. The trust, the fortune at the center of it all, was recovered. Every dollar Vanessa had stolen was clawed back through the courts, and the whole of it, freed at last from the hands that had killed for it, came under honest administration. And because the beneficiary Rosalind had named, my grandson Samuel, was truly gone, the question arose of where that fortune should go. There were legal complexities I will not bore you with, and Frank guided me through all of them. But in the end, a great deal of it came to rest where I could direct it, as the last living connection to Rosalind, and to Margaret, and to the boy the money had been meant for. And that is where I come to the part of this story that means the most to me. More than the arrest, more than the sentences, more even than the day I held Eli in that emptied room. I took a large portion of that recovered fortune, the fortune that had been meant for a grandson who never got to grow up, and I built something in Margaret's name. My Margaret was a pediatric nurse for 31 years. She spent her whole working life caring for other people's children, sick children, frightened children, children whose families could barely afford to be there. And she spent the last years of her life grieving a grandchild she was not allowed to see. And she died, never knowing that he was already gone, and never knowing that another child, a stolen child, was out there in the dark, needing exactly the kind of fierce protective love she had to give. So I built, with that money, the Margaret Reyes Fund for the protection of children. It exists to do the specific thing that no one did, in time for the 2 boys at the heart of my family's tragedy. It funds advocates and investigators, and legal help for children who are hidden, trafficked, falsely reported, erased, the children who fall through the cracks between systems, the children whom no one is looking for, because someone has arranged for no one to look. It is Margaret's love, which had nowhere left to go, given a place to go at last. There is a small plaque at its office. It has her name, and the dates of her life, and beneath them, a line I chose, the thing she said to me, in her last clear week, so that boy knows he was loved. That is the whole mission, in her own words. It is the truest thing I have ever built, and I built my whole life out of numbers. And there is a scholarship too, a smaller thing, but one that matters to me. In the name of Samuel Reyes, my true grandson, Margaret's Sammy, the boy with her eyes who never got his chance. It goes each year to a child aging out of the foster system, a child alone in the world, with no family behind them, to help them go to school and build a life. Because that is what Sammy never got, and it is the only way I know to make his short, stolen life mean something in the world that failed him. He is honestly mourned now. He has a real grave, with his real name on it, next to Margaret, where he belongs, where I can visit them both together. It took everything I had to give him that, and it is the accomplishment of my life. Now, Eli. The legal road was long, and Frank warned me it might not end where I hoped, and there were months where I did not let myself believe. An old man of 71 is not, on paper, an obvious guardian for a traumatized 9-year-old boy. But I had a great many things in my favor. I had the resources, now, to give him everything he could need. I had Paige, his aunt in all the ways that mattered, who was part of his life and always would be, and who advocated for me fiercely. I had Frank, who is the best lawyer I know, and who fought for this harder than he has ever fought for anything. And I had, above all, the simple, undeniable fact of what had passed between that boy and me. He had run to me. Out of everyone in the world, in his darkest hour, he had chosen my door. And when they asked him, gently, carefully, where he wanted to be, he said my name. It took the better part of a year, but Eli came home to me, to the small bedroom at the end of the hall, painted a warm pale blue, with Margaret's books on the shelf. He is my son now, in every way the law allows, and every way it doesn't. I am too old to be his father, and so we have not tried to make me one. He calls me Grandpa. He decided that himself. I did not ask him to. One morning, a few months after he came home, he just said it, passed me the milk, and said, "Thanks, Grandpa," and I had to go into the other room so he wouldn't see an old man weep over a carton of milk. He is healing. It is slow, the way all real healing is slow, the way the case was slow, the way learning to be a father to Daniel again is slow. There are hard nights still, nightmares, fears that surface without warning, the deep wariness of a child who learned too early that adults lie and that the wrong word gets you hurt. We see a good counselor, the two of us. I have learned, at 71, to talk about feelings, which Margaret spent 43 years trying to teach me, and which it turns out a 9-year-old boy could finally accomplish. But he laughs now. That is the thing I hold on to. He laughs, real laughter, loud and unafraid. The laughter of a boy who has finally understood, all the way down, that he is safe, and that no one is ever going to send him anywhere, and that the old man down the hall would burn the whole world down before he let anything touch him. He has Margaret's eyes, this boy who is not my blood, and when he laughs, I swear to you, I see her. I sat him down, once, when he was ready, and I told him the whole truth, all of it, in the gentlest terms a child could bear, but the truth, because I had learned in the hardest possible way what lies due to a family, and I was never going to build this new small family on a single one of them. I told him about the first Sammy, the boy whose name he had worn, and I told him that boy was real and mattered and was honestly mourned now. And Eli was quiet for a long time, and then he asked if we could visit Sammy's grave, so that Sammy would know he wasn't forgotten. And we did. The two of us stood at that grave, next to Margaret's, a stolen boy and an old man, and Eli put a small stone on the headstone and said, quietly, "Thank you for your name. I'm going to take good care of it. I keep it for both of us now." I do not have the words for what that did to me. I am an old man, and I have used up most of my words in this account, and I have none left for that moment. I only tell you it happened, because it is the finest thing I have ever witnessed a human being do, and he was 10 years old when he did it. So that is the story. That is what the boy handed me on the porch in the rain. Not just a photograph, a thread. And I pulled it, patiently, the way I have pulled every thread in my long life, all the way to the end, and the whole terrible tapestry came apart, and out of the wreckage of it, I was able to pull one living child into the light. I am 73 now. Eli is 11, the age the first Sammy would have been. He is upstairs, as I write this, doing his homework, or more likely avoiding it. In a little while I will call him down for dinner, Margaret's recipe, the one I have finally learned to make almost as well as she did. And tomorrow we will do the ordinary things, the school run, the groceries, the small, unglamorous business of a life, which is, I have come to understand, the whole prize. Not the courtroom, not the sentences, not even the justice, hard won as it was. The prize is the ordinary morning, safe, with someone you love, that a great many people worked and risked and sacrificed to make possible. I told you at the beginning that patience is the most underestimated weapon a person can carry, because everyone assumes a quiet man is a harmless one. I want to leave you with the truth I learned at the end of it, the thing I would tell every person who has ever been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated, written off as too old or too soft, or too slow to matter. They mistake the old lion's stillness for weakness. They see him lying quiet at the edge of the water, letting the whole world walk past, and they think he has no teeth left. But the old lion is not still because he is weak. He is still because he is patient, and because he knows something the rest of the plain has forgotten. He knows that his moment will come to the water, and that when it does, he will not need to chase. He will only need to be exactly where he always was, waiting, and to rise, one last time, at precisely the right moment, for precisely the right reason. I was quiet my whole life. I let the world underestimate me my whole career. And when it finally mattered, when a brave boy stood on my porch in the rain and handed me a photograph, and the last true purpose of my life, I rose from the water's edge, patient and unhurried and absolutely certain, and I did not miss. They should never have told that boy his grandfather was dead, because this old lion still had one hunt left in him, and it was the only one that ever truly mattered. If this story stayed with you, do me one last favor. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And tell me about someone in your own life who was underestimated and turned out to be stronger than anyone knew. Like this video, so more people can find it. And subscribe to Old Lion Stories, because there are more stories to tell, and every one of them is for you.